Hari Om. Can you hear me fine? Okay. Hari Om. So I'll be taking you through today's class. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Hari Om. Vakratunda Mahakaya Suryakoti Samaprabha Nirvignam Kurume Deva Sarvakaryeshu Sarvada Saraswati Namastubhyam Varade Kamarupini Vidyarambam Karishyami Siddhir Bhavatu Me Sada. Om Gurur Brahma Gurur Vishnu Gurur Devo Maheshwaraha Guru Sakshat Param Brahma Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. We'll quickly recap some of the aspects we have covered in the last 3 weeks. And we have received some feedback and inputs. I've tried to bake in some of those feedbacks, like, putting some quiz questions so that it can provoke, some kind of thought process, and also to summarize what you are learning. So I thought we'll put some quiz questionnaires. So one of the things as part of the format today is, I'm not doing it an online quiz. I'll just show some questions on the slides. You can respond in the chat with your answers. It'll be usually, multiple choice, about 6 or 7 I have. So once you answer, whoever gets the correct answer first, I will call that out, at least the top 2 people. But we will run our, discussion based on those questions. So that was one useful input, which I'm thinking we'll incorporate. The second one I saw feedback was to include, a little bit more pictorial aspects so that people can relate to what is being spoken about. So that also I've tried to incorporate in today's talk. So I will, at the end of the class, you can give your input so we can try and see if we can, enhance this. So coming back to the recap, few things, key things that I felt were covered in the last few sessions, primarily by Jaishankar ji. So one of the key areas that he spoke about was means of knowledge, or what is called as pramana. So when we talk about religion, when we talk about Ishvara, or we used to call God, only God and all that, what are we basing our views on, right? Is there a valid means by which we get to know this? That is where the aspect of science also came into picture. So are Vedas scientific? So science has a means of knowing things. It could be through perception, or certain kind of inferences, or enhanced perception. So these are things, when I say enhanced perceptions, like, using a microscope or using a scanner, and then science comes up with theorems, it makes inferences, all those aspects, correct? So these are all means of knowing. Similarly, is Veda yes independent means of knowing? So those things were discussed. So A means of knowing is supposed to be anadigatam, abaditam, palavat, all that, right? Arthabodhakatvam, all these things have to be there in a pramana. It should be non-transgressible. So what I see with my eye shouldn't be transgressed by my ears. If I see a color using my eye, the eye alone should be the means for knowing a color. So then eye becomes a means of knowing. So I cannot say that using my tongue I can know the color. If I say that and if it is valid, then I can't say that eyes are a means for knowing color. That means the domain of eye as a means of knowledge is independent of a tongue as a means of knowledge, correct? So a tongue is a means for knowing taste. An eye is a means for knowing a form. An ear is a means for knowing sound. So these are all perception. Together they are called direct perception. And then inference is also a means of knowing. Similarly, Veda or Shruti is considered a means of knowing because it is got its own scope and it is not transgressed. So what Veda reveals is not transgressed by my eyes or nose or inferences. Therefore, what is known through Veda cannot be transgressed by science also. But neither can it be refuted, nor it can be known through other means. Then only it becomes a means of knowledge. If it is refuted, then it is not an independent means of knowledge. So those things I think Jaishankar ji covered a lot in detail. I don't want to repeat the same thing fully. I just wanted to just recap. Then there was discussion about what is Shraddha. Shraddha is, like he said, giving a benefit of doubt until the means of knowledge is being operated upon. So until I use my eye to see the color, I open the eye with a Shraddha. There is a possibility that it will show me the color. That is the benefit of doubt. I may not know, I may not have a way to prove it, but until I open the eye, I don't have a choice. If I have to see the color, I don't have a choice because my ears or nose or tongue or my touch is not going to show me the color. There is only choice is to open the eyes. So I don't have a choice, but then I need to give a certain benefit of doubt that it may work. Then only I'll open my eye, correct? Similarly, for Veda as a means of knowledge to operate, you need to initially give it a benefit of doubt. That is called Shraddha. It's not a blind belief because you are going to employ the means of knowledge, and if it does not work, it does not work. You are going to know that right away, right? So until you know, we are not talking about post-death going to somewhere and all that, right? A lot of things which is for which means of knowledge is Veda is about things which are beneficial to you as you live. Therefore, that is Shraddha. Okay. So I don't want to keep spending a lot of time on things which are already covered, but this was called as Shraddha. And then Jaishankar ji also spoke about what is Dharma. Dharma for us, the order or the laws of nature are not actions of Bhagavan, but the laws are themselves Bhagavan. So I don't want to use the word God now, because we said everything is God and we have now named it as Bhagavan, right? Because the moment you say God, you are thinking of a person. So a Bhagavan, because he is omnipresent, how is he present? He or she or whatever, or it, however you want to call. I don't want to call it as it because the moment I say it, it becomes an inert, a non-living entity, right? Therefore, we can use he for the sake of, a pronoun there. So when a Bhagavan as a conscious entity has to be recognized as in the form of the Niyati. the order. So whenever we are in touch with order, we are in touch with Bhagavan. Whenever we are aligned to an order, we are in touch with Bhagavan. That's why whenever you do a righteous thing, a correct thing, you feel happy. Why? Because it is in tune with your nature and it is in tune with Bhagavan. Therefore, there is a certain sense of happiness whenever you are in touch with. I told the other day, when you are in touch with the total, you are happy. When you learn a new thing, which is a truth, which is a law, you are happy. We spoke about Archimedes and all that, right? So because you get a joy, because you are in touch with the total. So when you are in touch with the total, with the reality or with the order or a niyati, when you are in harmony, there is a happiness because you are in touch with Bhagavan. That's why when there is compassion, when you give somebody, when you help somebody, you are happy because compassion is the basic emotion. Because everything is one. I said that order, a niyati, and there is a total. A tree is a tree as part of the total, set of plants or living creatures, right? So when I say I am a human, I am part of the whole. So like that, the niyati and the order and the total, everything is a samashti and vyashti. So there is an individual and there is a collective called total. So when you relate to the total, when you are in touch with the completeness, then you are happy. The moment you take yourself to be, an individual, a small thing which is unconnected with the other things in the world, then you feel afraid. You feel, insignificant. You feel threatened. You are under pressure because you are competing. You are competing against the whole world. The moment you are a competitor, you are afraid because how many things are you competing with? There are forces, there are people, there are different thoughts, there are so many things. So you are small speck in the whole scheme of things. So if you take yourself to be that unconnected with everything else, then you are unhappy, you are afraid, but once you recognize yourself to be part of the whole, then you relate to the total. That is where you see Bhagavan as the form of order or niyati. These things Jaishankar ji covered, and also a few things about freedom to relate to Bhagavan and other things. Now let's ask some questions based on whatever we have covered so far. So I want you to put the answer in the chat. So the question, the definition of prophet. Prophets are proclaimers of the will of God. That's how the Western religions define prophet. If this is what is a prophet, then can you answer who are the prophets in Hinduism? Okay, I have one answer. Okay, good. So we have quite a few answers and most of you are correct. So the correct first person to give the correct answer is Gigi and then Abhinav Girish. And that's third one is Sumati Ramana. So naturally the answer is none. I mean, all these are saints. They all have contributed or great contributors to Sanatana Dharma, no doubt. But what is the definition of prophet? Will of God. Correct. There is a few things which are presupposed here. So God as an entity who defines a certain will, this is what you should do and all that. And prophet carries that word into the created earth. That is how they look upon as prophets. We don't have, in Sanatana Dharma, we don't look upon our rishis and our Mahatmas in that sense. Okay, not because they are not to compare their greatness with prophets and all that, but because we don't believe that God sends prophets to the world and all that, because God itself is not away from this Jagat. We just saw that. So the creation is not separate from Bhagavan. So God is not sitting somewhere to be able to send a prophet here. So God is, in fact, the final vision is you are yourself not separate from the God. When God is everywhere, that cannot preclude you. Now you should ask the question, how can that be true? I am not God, right? That should be your question. But anyway, we will come to all that later. But the point is, we don't have the concept of prophet. So we have to understand that. Let's go to the next question. Some of these I will dwell for some time. This one I'm not. Let's go to the next one. I have some 8 points. Question is, which of the following is true? These are some long sentences. If you want, I can read it. The first one is, to be the follower of Hinduism, I need to have belief or faith in the God. It's a fundamental requirement. That's number one. Second, we need a religion to understand what is right and what is wrong. All religions are simply different paths to same God. We hear this very often. And then truth is one, paths are many. Again, in the context of religion, okay. Hindus don't worship idols. Then God can be only formless. All religions lead to same goal. Hinduism, there was no such thing as Hinduism as a religion. Only British brought so many things together and called it as Hinduism. Some are very close. I'll give another 10 seconds. Okay. So I'll tell. Okay, this is a little interesting. So you will think Hindus do worship idols, right? I'll come to the answer little later. Okay, this question was to make you think. I'll come to the answer because I don't want to. It's going to be a little controversial answer, but let me first give you the background, right? This one, yeah, I already showed you, I think, in the second session. The forms of greeting and altars of worship are universal. So, and I think Jaishankar ji also spoke about spirit behind the forms. So, and I think I spoke about when I want to wish a person, I shake the hands and all that. So the form has a certain spirit behind it. So when I do something, when I am greeting somebody, I am not that act has a certain meaning behind the entire person. Not when I shake the hand, it's not about the hand. When I'm going and this person, if you see this Jewish prostrating on a wall, it's not about that wall, isn't it? It's something more meaningful than the wall that they are connecting to. Because everywhere there is a wall, but that particular wall has a particular meaning. Similarly, when any of these other religious people go and pray to a particular form, there is a meaning beyond just the stone which is there. Isn't it? Not every stone this person will go and pray. So there is a particular meaning to that particular form. So there is a spirit behind it. So this we already saw again. So I know it is little verbose. A Lord, because the Lord or Bhagavan is omnipresent in the form of order, in the form of all that is here, that Lord can be invoked in any form. We saw some examples, right? Even turmeric, we invoke the god. A sculpture, for example, right? In India, suppose somebody is making a Ganesha sculpture. A sculptor is making a sculpture. Till that sculpture is completed, it is still stone. Correct? That person doesn't care. It just keeps lying there, and then he will keep sculpting it for days and months. He wouldn't care about it, right? It will be just lying. He just wants to keep it safe. That's all. And then he receives money and then takes it and puts it in some place, some temple. And then a prana pratishtha is done. The same sculptor now won't even get into that Garbhagriha. It is the same stone. He only made that particular form, sculpture. But after prana pratishtha is done, it is Bhagavan. So, are we worshipping the idol, the stone? If it is the stone, that person who was the sculptor, he should have started worshipping it even when he was making it. But the question that came that time was, then why specific forms? And I already spoke a little bit about Dakshinamurti, right? That it has meaning much beyond just a human-like form. See, you can relate to a human form. So, Jaishankar spoke about this, that you relate to a Bhagavan as a father, as a mother. So, you need a certain human-like depiction for you to relate to. Human-like or even Ganesha kind of thing, right? So, where there is a certain characteristic which has to be associated with an altar so that you can relate. Otherwise, it is very difficult, right? If you have to pray to a wall, it is very, how do you relate? Even people who are praying to a direction, they would have their own conception of God, correct? Even when they give a name, they say He's all-mercy, He takes care of you. That means it's a He is somewhere. Maybe I don't know the form in my visualization, but He is sitting somewhere. That's how they look at it. So you need a way to relate. Therefore, a human-like or some kind of a form, right, with the elephant head, whatever it is, has to be given, but it should be relatable. So that is important. But at the same time, what is the true nature of God? I want to use this nature, just use it with, listen to it with a little bit of caution, because nature is a little loaded word. But what is God, right? Also needs to be brought out in these altars. So when in Sanatana Dharma, when these altars of worship are given, it is also loaded with a meaning which is much more than just a personification alone. So I spoke about a lot of things, Panchabhuta and all that here, right? Even this Chinmudra, it has a meaning. So this Trigunas, if you leave and a jiva becomes one with Ishvara, it becomes a total. This whole means it's a total. So there is no gap between an individual and the Ishvara. So that becomes the total. So each one, if you see in this altar, it has a certain meaning. I covered a lot of other meanings also here, right? Like God is both male and female, all that abhinna nimitta. This also we covered. So I just want to recap because this ideal question is coming. So you are also, not only you are relating, so in this case there is no personification, at least even though we think of Shiva and all that, but this, it has a meaning much more than just a stone, right? It is, we are talking about, I spoke about this already the other day. If it is, everything is God, and that everything, if it has to be given a form, then it is just a collection. So all that is here is God, is what is represented. Similarly, very interesting, if you see the altars of worship that is given in Sanatana Dharma, I don't want to use the term Hinduism. If you want, you can relate to it that way. But it is not who is God, right? It is this who means what? It's just a person. So we have to go beyond that. But more importantly, that is why there is a mysticism around how the Sanatana Dharma God or altars are. Because it has meaning much more than just a person. So when Ganesha means, see, naturally you don't find this kind of a person anywhere in the world, right? With an elephant head, 4 hands, all that you don't. But why? I mean, aren't these rishis, don't even they know that people don't look like this? Then there is something beyond just a personification, and that is what. So the whole thing about Ishvara or the God, if you want to use the term, or Bhagavan, is you need to understand what that Bhagavan is. That's why each of this is. So I'll give you one example. Even this Puranic stories. There, you know the story of Markandeya, because you asked for some pictures, right? So I pulled out a few things. So the story of Markandeya. So Markandeya is given a certain number of years. Now he is a bhakta, then Yamadharma comes, he goes running, and then he goes and holds on to a Shivalinga, and then Ishvara comes, and then he kills Yama, and then he gives him life back. This is a story. And this Ishvara is also called Kala Kala, Kala Samhara Murti, Kala Hari, Kala Hara, Kala Hari. All these are names for Ishvara or Bhagavan. So what is this Kala? Kala means, one we take it as Yamadharma, but Kala is another meaning, right? Time. So what consumes everything is time. You have to understand that. Kalo sarva bhakshakaha. Think of death. If you have to imagine death, what is death? What eats everything? Time eats everything. There is nothing which stays beyond time. With the passage of time, everything vanishes. Even mountains vanish. Maybe something will take million years. But time eats away everything. That's why Yama is also called Kala. In the form of time, he eats. Everything has set. So something stays for 6 years, somebody stays for 15 years, something stays for 30 years. But time eats. And with the time, everything is changing. Every second there is a change, right? Our own body. The body that you see today is not the same as tomorrow, isn't it? And every 8 years, they say it completely rejuvenates. Cells change, not rejuvenates, it changes, right? It's constantly changing. The world around you is constantly changing. A person at time T1 is not the same as person at time T2, right? His hair is grayed, his cells have changed, his health has changed. So time keeps, so even your body, your surroundings, everything keeps changing in time. Nothing stays constant. And the time is the one which keeps consuming. And the one who consumes that Kala, right, who is beyond time, who transcends time, is Kala Kala. So we take time, space, and objects are as constant, and time and space are as absolutes. That's what Newtonian physics said, right? Which is now challenged by scientists. Because time and space also are related. The time that you see in the waken, in your own dream, the time is different. Within fraction of second, you experience a big story in your dream. So your scale of time in your own experience is different from waking and dream. If you are happily enjoying a movie, time runs like this. But if you are standing in a hot sun, time is so slow. Why? Because time is also based on how you perceive, and the scale of time is different. So what is time is another very interesting question. But more importantly, that which transcends time is Bhagavan. So what is transcending time? So what is before time? What is after time? So after time itself is a word which is within the concept of time, isn't it? So when I say beyond time, so that is where the Ishvara is not a person. If it is a person, I can't call that person as Kala Kala. That person, if that person also has a body, that body should have come in time. That body will also go in time. Maybe God will stay for 500 million years or zillion years. Doesn't matter. But then time will consume Bhagavan also, right? Therefore, the Bhagavan cannot be a body or a person in time. That's why that Bhagavan is called Kala Kala. When once you recognize that Bhagavan, then you transcend time. So Kala, that is that. So each of this, it's a simple story, but it is not about Markandeya alone. It is about understanding what is Bhagavan. That's why it's called. The story is given for simple mind to just initially understand, but then it has a big import. Similarly, there are other Puranic stories. Right? The story about Manthana, right? Samudra Manthana, the churning of Sagara, and then what comes out of it. Initially, you have this hala hala, the poison comes out, and then Airavata comes out, Lakshmi comes out, all that comes. They all have their own meaning, right? The context is what? This jnanam is what is the. So I don't want to, it's just a very deep thing, but these are figurative stories, and we will come to it later. But the stories have an import, they have a very deep meaning in it, and that defines what is Ishvara, what is the world, what is our experience here. Now, these are for knowing more. It is not just a belief, right? How can somebody come and churn the ocean, right? And what is the point in churning the ocean? And how come when you churn the ocean, some elephant comes out? To just an elephant coming. So it is, so obviously these are all figurative expressions of certain facts. Okay. And these are people who are extremely great minds. Okay. They are not giving some stories for, for some comics. So there is a mysticism with the form. Somebody asked this question. That's why I wanted to cover this. Each of these forms, they have a very deep meaning. For example, Kali is standing on Shiva, and she has this 51 skulls around her, so many hands, tongue protruding out, 3 eyes. What is all this? Right? They will say, hey, these are very barbaric gods, because they don't understand. The intent itself is to be mystic only, because the idea is not that particular form, but behind that, what is the spirit? What is it trying to convey? If all that is here is Bhagavan, God or Goddess, then how do I understand that? Towards that, all these altars are given. And I'll just give you one thing. It is very, you may not understand in this case, it is too early, but I just want you to just the Shiva and Shakti, right? Just take it like this. Suppose my mind is Shiva. Okay, I'm just giving you a simpler way to relate to this. And I am in deep sleep, that is Shiva, right? I am at rest. When I wake up to a dream or to a vacant state, I am an agitated person. Agitated as an active person. So the one who was in deep sleep is the same person now active in the waken and dream. Correct? They are no different. So the creation is waken and dream, and the basic person is the one who is sleeping. Suppose this is a concept. Now you look at this picture. The basic person who is sleeping is Shiva, and the one who is waken and dream is the Shakti, Kali. This is one. If I have to depict it in a form, this is one aspect. Okay, leave the skull and other things for now. Just to think of one active lady standing on top of a lying person. So it is a figurative expression to depict that a basic person is a deep sleep person, and an active lady is the one who is actually representing the waken and dream. This is one aspect. Like that, each of the things on this Rupa, this altar, has a meaning. The three eyes have a meaning. The 50 plus skulls around her has a meaning. Each of those have a meaning which needs you to understand. That's why the Bhagavan is not just only to relate, but also to recognize. A jnani recognizes this all the way. And then the other question is, if every form is Bhagavan, I can do a turmeric puja, right? Like we do. But why temples are so special? That's where the Prana Pratishtha comes into play. How do you do Prana Pratishtha, right? See, Prana Pratishtha can be done only by a live person. That's why this mantra and all this. See, when we do puja, we say, from my prana may this altar get it. Prana and Pratishtha, from myself I make it happen. So the Chaitanya is given to the altars by mantra and by the people by invoking a prana in them. So an altar in a temple has slightly, so that's why you see, that is a difference. I want to show that we don't want you to think that a temple itself is not required. What is so special? Because everything is an altar. A picture in my room is same as what is in the temple, right? A prana pratishtha has slightly more to it than just a form. Now let's look at this. Obviously, one is wrong because belief in God is not a fundamental requirement. Fundamental requirement, in fact, there are, I think Jaishankarji covered this, right? There are people, Mimamsakas, who don't even believe in God or Bhagavan. They just say that the Veda itself can give me everything. The Yaga, Yajnas will give me. They are considered Astikas. So there is no faith or belief. It is not a fundamental requirement, right? Only a dharma is important. But a Bhagavan recognition is not a fundamental requirement, right? Second, we need a religion to understand what is right and wrong. Is it so? Do you need really the 10 commandments or whatever, right? Old Testament, you come and say you should not lie. You should not hurt others. We don't need, so certain things are told. It's nothing wrong to restate, but it is not essential because it is all given. What is right and wrong in a Samanya Dharma is already given to you in creation. Because since you don't want that to happen to you, you will naturally not be expected to do that to others. Correct? So naturally, you don't need what is right and wrong. For that, you don't need a religion. Then comes religions are simply different paths to same God. Again, the same God is where the catch is, right? So each religion's view of what is God itself is different. So if the whole idea of what is God itself is different, so naturally the path to God cannot be the same, because somebody is talking about God sitting in heaven, so only faith will take you to that God. So how can they all be the same paths? I mean, they say reaching to the same paths, reaching to the same God. For some, a vision which says all that is here is God, versus a vision which says God is sitting somewhere, has to be different. Okay, so obviously 3 is also not right. Fourth one, truth is one, paths are many. Actually, this is almost same as number 3. The reason I gave that is because we keep hearing this. Therefore, I mentioned that as a separate statement. Otherwise, 3 and 4 are actually the same. Hindus don't worship idols. The nuance here is the word idol, right? We don't worship the idol. We worship the spirit behind. That is why the altars of worship, I told you, have a meaning behind them. So a sculpture is not an idol. We know it is stone. We know it is a sculpture. We know it is a lump of turmeric. We all know when we go and bring a clay Ganesha that it is clay. So we don't worship that particular idol, but we worship. Suppose I am pointing this finger to this wall. Okay. So the finger's job is what? Is to show the wall, right? It is an altar. Okay. It is an indicator. So this Ganesha, the form that you see there, in you, it is invoked. You are relating not to that clay idol, but you are relating to that Ganesha, right? Whatever that stands for. Ganesha means he has certain attributes, right? He is always happy. He is full. He has Purnam. You know, he is a matter of joy. He respects his father and mother. He goes, so all that characteristic of Ganesha, he removes all obstacles. So all this is already inbuilt when you are looking at that altar. So you are not worshipping that idol. You are worshipping that idea, right? That what is Ganesha for you. So whenever you hear something like Hindus are idol worshippers, you have to clearly understand that is not correct. It is a way to, actually people either don't understand or they want to, it's an intent to, it's a put Hindus down, right? Or Sanatana Dharmis down. It is told in a way that it's not in a very respectable way that they use the term that Hindus are idol worshippers. So we have to be clear, we don't worship idols. Sanatana Dharmis don't worship idol. Through altar of worship, we worship Bhagavan. And it is not any different with other religions also. Like I showed in the earlier picture, everybody does that. Otherwise, why should somebody go to a particular assembly, right? Assembly of God, or look at the cross, or look at, so everything is an altar of worship. So there is nothing very different that Sanatana Dharmis do. So we don't worship idols. We worship only Bhagavan through an altar of worship. God can only be formless is also not right, because God is formless as well as forms. If everything is Bhagavan, the forms also have to be Bhagavan only. See, you can't leave something out. Saying forms are not Bhagavan, it means that the Lord is not omnipresent, right? He is limited by forms. So therefore that is not right. 7 is same as 4 and 3. They don't lead to the same goal, because they don't even say they have the same goal, correct? The goal of some of the theological religions is to take you to heaven. See, you can give a different meaning. So in your mind, you can say, hey, heaven means the same thing. Maybe they are meaning, but that is not what those religions claim, right? Their intent is not to say everything here is Bhagavan, right? They say everything here is for a man's consumption. So they say the God created this world and all the animals and all the plants and all the things for you to consume. That is very different from something which says everything here is Bhagavan, so relate to it in that way, right? That you are part of the total. How can they be the same? How can they reach the same goal? Therefore, that's not the case. And I changed this sentence there. So see, there is another thinking that Hinduism never existed. Only British brought everything together and called it as Hindu and all that. But Sanatana Dharma existed. Okay, we have to be very clear. And also that Him Dushayati, the Hindu that Jaishankarji spoke about, even if we have to give a meaning to word Hindu, that's fine. But as a Dharma, it existed for thousands of years. You call it as Hindu, you call it as Sanatana Dharma, you say that it's a religion with no name, that's fine. But it is not a fact that this is something which was cobbled up together by British. Okay. Okay. Now one more quiz. Let's do this. Okay, let's do this because the next few slides focus on what I'm trying to tell here. So why don't we? I will also take a 2-minute break so that you people can answer this one. Which of the following are most key aspect? Okay, focus on this most key aspect. A lot of them can be correct, but which is the most key? Another 20 seconds for others also to answer. Okay. So I give it to Ramya Ramakrishnan. I think she did it first. So I will, the answer is 4. Okay. That I'll tell you why. I will come to that. So let me look at this, right? Where irrespective of, see, within our Sanatana Dharma, there are multiple sects, right? We all know there is Advaita Sampradaya, Visishtadvaita, Advaita, Shaivam, Shaktam, Kaumara. There are so many things. Even Sikhism, in a way, is part of Hindu, the larger umbrella. Even Buddhism, for that matter, right? One thing you will find common is there is a Guru Sishya teaching parampara. Teaching, I said in the earlier session also, there is a difference between preaching and teaching. Teach is for you to make, for a person to make the other person see a reality. Suppose I say, I think I gave this example. When I say 5 plus 4 is equal to 3 plus 1 plus 4 plus 6 minus 5 or something like that, right? The numbers on the left side are of the left side of the equal to is different from the numbers that are on the right side of the equal to. When I make you see how both are same, then I am teaching. I am making you see a reality. Then only it becomes a teaching, right? because I make you see. I am not telling, it's not like, you know, like, history where you say this is what happened, that is what happened, and then you just memorize it. But teaching is, I mean, you teach history also, but generally teaching is to make the other person see something, right? Then it becomes a live teaching. So mostly in our culture, we emphasize on learning. The Guru Shishya Parampara is important. And interestingly, I think Jaishankar ji covered it a bit there in his session. Even avatars, they didn't come and say that I am God, I will do magic, whatever, right? What is it called? Not magic, miracle to make something happen. That is not the focus. They also came and learnt and they taught. So Krishna went to Sandipani to learn. They didn't come and say, I am a prophet, I brought you this, all that. No, they taught, but they taught as teachers. Right? So they also they showed that it's not that Krishna as a Bhagavan needed to go to Sandipani to learn, right? Yes, Bhagavan himself took an avatar, but he showed the world the importance of the teaching. And even in Upanishad Vedas, when something is told, right, something is revealed, it is revealed as a conversation or dialogue between a Guru and Shishya. Whether it is Kathopanishad, whether it is Mundakopanishad, whether it is Brihadaranyaka, anywhere, it is always a samvada, a discussion or a teaching. See, this picture is Nachiketas goes to Yamaloka, and he goes and then Yama teaches. He goes and says, what happens after death? Can you please teach me? Yama says, I won't teach you. I will give you 2 boons because this is a big secret. I can't teach you this. Instead, you take some boons from me. He says, no. He takes the boon as well as he learns this. That's how that whole story goes. But the point is, even the celestials, they themselves teach and they also go and learn. There are stories about how Indra went and learned, how Brahma himself learned. The teaching and the Guru Shishya is core to our religion. Even the spiritual practices, rituals. I'll come to rituals later, tomorrow maybe. But the heart of the ritual is a spiritual teaching. Principally, it is the teaching. I told about Bhagavan, right? Krishna didn't tell Arjuna, he didn't say some miracle or anything like that, right? He didn't say magically I'll liberate you. Arjuna says, I am fed up of this thing, can you help me? Then what did Krishna do? He taught. See, you need to understand that. Arjuna says, Shishyasteham Shadimam Tvam Parapannam. I am surrendering to you. May you teach me. And Krishna teaches as to how he should lead the life and how he can get liberated. He didn't say, hey, I touch and then you are liberated, right? That's not what, you never will find such thing in our ancient things, right? In most of the other religions, it's miracle. He touched and then lepers became all right. Nothing wrong. I'm just focusing on Sanatana Dharma alone, right? Here, the miracle is teaching and how one recognizes what is Bhagavan. So it is the key. It doesn't matter whether you are talking about Bhagavan, you are talking about the world. You say you and Bhagavan are different, whether you and Bhagavan are the same, or you are part of Bhagavan, or there is no Bhagavan, doesn't matter. But the fact is, it was always a knowledge-driven thing. You are free to come and debate with me or have a samvada with me, saying that I don't believe there is Bhagavan, right? That is okay. So the Nastika Darshanas had their own place. And the attitude towards knowledge, right? Across, see, these are some of these stories, it's very exclusive to South India, right? Only Tamilians know the story, right? The Swami Malai, for example. But the idea is the same. See, the Swami Malai story, many of you would have known because you are from here. The idea, some may not. So, Lord Subramanya or Muruga, he is in outside the Kailasa. He is just playing, and Brahma visits Shiva. He comes to Kailasa. Okay, so on the way he was thoughtful. He was just going. He has some problem. He wants to meet Shiva, so he just ignored whoever is outside Kailasa, and then he gets inside. So Murugan or Subramanya, whatever you want to call the name, Bhagavan is this is a story, right? So he gets angry. So when Brahma comes out after meeting Lord Shiva, he is coming out. So when he comes out, he stops him. He says, I was playing here outside and I am also Bhagavan only. So when you are going to meet Shiva, you should have also prayed to me before you go inside, right? You didn't even bother about me. Okay, so how can you do that? Then Brahma says, no, I was a little lost. I was thinking about a few things. So I was lost in thought. That's why I didn't do. Then Subramanya says, see, you can't, you are a creator, right? You are a Srishti Karta. You can't say I was lost in thought. So you should have been cautious, right? So I'll ask you this to check if you have. Can you tell me what this Omkara or Pranava means? Brahma says, no, I don't know. And Subramanya says, no, as a creator, every creation happens after Pranava, right? I told the other day. See, these are all concepts that you have to understand. Pranava is, I said what is Omkara and how everything here is Omkara only, right? So this is figuratively, there is this dialogue which goes. Then Brahma says he doesn't know, then he arrests Brahma, and then Lord Shiva comes and asks. Everybody goes and prays to Lord Shiva that Brahma is stopped, and then Subramanya himself is doing all the creation. Then there is a problem and all that. They are going and complaining. Then Lord Shiva says, do you know? He goes and asks Subramanya what happened. He says, no, this Brahma didn't even know what is Pranava, so meaning of Pranava, so I arrested him. Then he asks, do you know the meaning? He says, of course I know. Okay, then Shiva says, why don't you tell me? Then he says, no, you can't ask me like this. If you want to learn from me, then I am Guru and you are my Shishya. Right? So you better learn in the way that a Shishya learns from Guru. Okay, then I will teach you. Okay, then Lord Shiva puts him on the lap, and then he does this, and then he asks with respect, then Subramanya teaches Pranava, right? This is the story. Now this is about, again there are a few things here, right? One, teaching, the importance of teaching. The importance of attitude to teaching and to learn. Even Shiva didn't say, hey, you are my son. I don't want to learn from you like this, right? When it comes to knowledge, it doesn't matter who you are learning from. So all these things are taught. Why? Because teaching becomes important in the religious culture. Even Lord Dakshinamurti, right, is shown as a teacher, because when you say a certain knowledge has to come from Guru to Shishya, there are few things we say comes from Guru to Shishya. There is a reason for it. Like what is Bhagavan? What is this? What is Brahman? What is the cause of the world? All these things cannot be learned by oneself. You need a means of knowing, I told you, right? So the means of knowing means it has to be passed on. It has to be revealed. Independent means of knowledge has to be independent. You can't, because the truth is about your own nature. So it has to be independent. So that means it needs a guru. So I need a guru to learn from, right? Then where did that guru learn? That guru has to learn from some other guru. And that guru also has to learn, because there is no other way. If it keeps on going, where does it end? Suppose you ask this question, you have a father, that person has a father, that person also has a father, and it goes on and on and on, zillions of years it has to go, but it has to stop somewhere, no? Where did it all start from? You have to only say it started from Bhagavan. Similarly, the first guru is Bhagavan himself, is what we say. But more important is the teaching tradition is central to Sanatana Dharma. You have to understand, because everything is about jnanam. Look at this another example, I'll tell you. Lord Ganesha, we have only 2 minutes. We'll continue tomorrow, but I'll close with this. Anyway, now you would have got the answer for that quiz I put out, right? When Vedavyasa wanted to write Mahabharata, he needed somebody to scribe. He wanted a scribe, okay? Then he prayed and Ganesha came. And then he told Ganesha, please, write Mahabharata to me. I will keep telling shlokas. Then Ganesha said, I can do it. But the moment you stop and take time, I will go away. Okay, if you agree to this condition, I will write for you. Then Vyasa says, that's okay, I will agree to it. But every shloka I tell you, you should understand the meaning of it and then only write. If you agree to this, I will also agree to that. Okay. They have an agreement and they write. And whenever Vyasa needed some time, he will write a very complicated shloka. Is what they say, because some of the shlokas in Mahabharata is very complicated. So they say that this is how this whole thing happened. So this is a story, right? And in that, Vyasa writes, na jnanena sadrisham pavitram vidyate. There is nothing greater than jnanam. Bhagavan says that in Gita. The knowledge is the greatest. And to show that only Vyasa wrote this. And Ganesha also came and supported this, right? Why Ganesha could have said, why did he come and write down such a Mahabharata scripture, right? Because even for Bhagavan, what is important is that is how our tradition looks upon. So what is important in Sanatana, and a couple of other quick things, right? There is no gender related thing. So we read about Rishika's, Jaishankar ji spoke about, right? Maitreyi Sambhashana, then Gargi Sambhashana. So we read about how the Rishi Patnis and people who actually gave mantras were also ladies, women. And age is never a hindrance, right? So we don't look upon whether somebody is young, it depends on who has the jnanam, go and take it. Right? We will cover a lot of these tomorrow. One last thing I'll leave it out with. Adi Shankara, you would have heard about the story of on Chandala, he comes in the way and then he gives him a knowledge and then he prays to him. In that, he says, Chandalostu Dvijostu Guruhu ityesha manisha mama. Whether it is Chandala or some other person, it doesn't matter. Provided this person has the knowledge and is able to teach me, I see this person as my guru. So what is important in our tradition is the knowledge. Okay, there is no hindrance to knowledge by caste, or caste is another thing we have to resist. There is nothing called caste in our tradition, but the category, a class of people, okay, or gender, or age. When it comes to knowledge takes the precedence. So that is the key import of the tradition. So we will see tomorrow. I think we have few things to be covered on this. So with this I stop. Let me unmute. Okay. So I don't know. Struggling to unmute. Allow participant to unmute myself. I'll just say. Okay, if you want, you can unmute and ask anything. So I've made all of you. If you want, you can unmute. If you have any questions on chat, also I can take.
Guruji, namaste. I have asked one question. This is Ram Narayanan. I have asked one question. That most key aspect of Hinduism there you asked that in that I think one is so no the previous set of questions. Truth is one, paths are many. The previous set of questions. So if our concept of truth is not the same as Abrahamic religions, then why is that not a correct statement?
Okay. Okay. So I don't see any questions. Okay. Truth is one, paths are many, right? Somebody has a question. Okay. So truth is okay. So there is, if you really want to debate, discuss that, right? So we will discuss in detail in another class. See, there is a paths are many from generally, okay, the truth we say with the Vedas show is all that is here is Bhagavan, and recognizing, realizing that is what we call a self-realization or moksha, right? Now, the only way to gain that is through knowledge. There is no difference. So that is because it is about, because of your ignorance, you are separated. By knowledge, you become one with Bhagavan or Brahman. Now, where the paths are many comes into picture is to qualify yourself to gain that. There can be many ways to do it. That is where all this karma yoga, somebody can do nadopasana, someone can do puja and all that, someone can do ritual, someone can do chanting. All that is fine. To make oneself qualified to gain that, we say it, you can qualify yourself through many paths. So to that extent, paths are many is fine. But what in the context of many religions, we can't say paths are many, goal is the same, because they all talk very different, totally different things. And one, it is totally opposite to, so they talk about God and Satan, the mind, you are filled with Satan and God, all that, right? It creates a different kind of situation. So we cannot say they all are similar paths, right? That is not acceptable. Yeah, because there's no reality to it. That's all. I mean, we are not against any religion or anything here, but we cannot also accept that they are all the same, because they are not.
Pranam.
If he did not do any miracles. Okay, see, we are, okay, the idea is, even in the worldly things, we talk about certain yogis getting some power, right? Having powers is something, even in our own life, we see that there are different kind of powers, even material powers that we possess. They also talk about some yogic powers. And Bhagavan has some additional, as a creator, when an avatara comes in, the avatara has certain powers. But that is not the focus, no. That's all we are saying. It's not that God is powerless. We are not saying God is powerless. But the idea is, the focus is on knowledge. That's all. So Jadayu Moksha and all is fine. I mean, the Puranic stories, like I also said, there are certain more meanings to these things. But even if you assume that these are powers, that is not contradicting what we are. The focus is on knowledge. Bhagavan may have powers, but how does it help us, right? We can take the Bhagavan's blessing, and but for us to gain, we need to understand the import. That's why knowledge becomes more important. Moksha cannot be given through any power. We have to understand what is moksha. Moksha, if it is about going to heaven, yeah, that is fine. Moksha is about getting some extra capabilities, or some other than 5 senses. If you can have 6th sense and get moksha, then all that miracle is fine. But that is not what we call as moksha. So moksha we will see later. Okay, it's a very involved topic. What is the main difference between worshipping Bhagavan and home? Worshipping Bhagavan in temple. Okay, see, Bhagavan in temple, because of lot of, see, the Sanidhyam that we talk about, right, in temple is also brought because of the Pratishta, the Agama, the mantras, and also a lot of people who come and pray there. They all contribute to certain Sanidhya, what we call as Parana Shakti, right, in those places. These are mystic things, okay. Again, these are up to one's, what I would say, if you believe in Tantra, Mantra and all that. But our general belief is, because so much of things happen. The altars of worship in temple have something more to them, like the Sri Chakra and Mahameru and all that. There is something in it. So we don't we can't equate what you can do at home to what is in temple, but you can bring similar Sanidhya in your home altars also. People who do Sri Vidya Upasana and Tantra Upasana and all that, they also do that at home. Okay. But there is a difference. I mean, so I'm not suggesting that you keep going to temple and pray only at home. That is not the intent here. So any form can be worshipped in, like I said, your own body is an altar, right? And I think I covered in the first class, even children, everything is worshipped because it all how you look at them, right? Because everything is Bhagavan. So you can relate to the Bhagavan in the way that you are comfortable. Okay, I think those are the questions. We'll see tomorrow anyway. We can. This is a much bigger topic. Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording first.